We continue in this session looking at Judaism, specifically moving from some of the rabbinical forms of Judaism into discussion of the different types of Judaism and how we see that evidenced in uh, different expressions of Judaism in the modern time. Where we finished up in the last session, though, we were looking at rabbinical interpretation, particularly as it related to the Torah and other aspects of the Hebrew Bible, and how the rabbis, over the course of several centuries, developed a extensive amount of literature focused on this attempt to try and make the uh, the text applicable to modern life. And we saw this in the Mishnah, the commentary on the Torah. We saw it in the Talmud, which is the Mishnah plus commentary on the Mishnah, and noted that the diversity of opinion found expressed in these different documents was not necessarily a bad thing. That instead, the give and take of logical argument, the back and forth of debate, was to be a virtue or be a value that was something important in the process of trying to find the meaning of God's law. We finished up talking about midrash, and midrash being a type of interpretation often based on imagination. And so we talked about the example of Isaac and the sacrifice of Isaac, and just one example of trying to give an age for Isaac, with the determination being shaped by some things in the text that may or may not have anything to do with Isaac's age, but also looking at how it reinterprets the text then if we understand Isaac, or if we assume Isaac was a young boy, even an early teenager, to theorize about him as an adult makes it a different type of story. And we also looked at how the rabbis can also use some elements of the text to comment on their contemporary concerns related to, for example, the issue of Judaism's connection with Christianity and Islam. I want to share just one other example of this process, not to suggest that they are comprehensive in any way, but to think about just the way the rabbis are approaching the text that might be a way that we don't usually think about as legitimate. But for the rabbis and for a lot of other people that were shaped by this thinking, it is a legitimate form of interpretation of the text. And so that's an important thing to recognize in this. This example draws on Psalm 145. Particularly, let's look at this passage. Why is there no noon verse in Psalm 145? Rabbi Yohanan explained that it is because Israel's downfall begins with that letter. As it is written, she has fallen, Naphalah in Hebrew, and will no more rise, the virgin of Israel. That's from Amos 5:2. Rabbi Naaman bar Isaac said, though David omitted the noon verse because it would have invoked Israel's downfall, nevertheless, David reconsidered and in divine inspiration added the next verse, the Lord lifts up all who are fallen, Nophalim in Hebrew, and straightens all who are bent, Psalm 145:13. Now, at first glance, this might be a very confusing type of discussion, especially if you would pull open Psalm 145 and read it. Psalm 145 in Hebrew is an acrostic poem, an acrostic psalm. Acrostic psalms, each line or each section begin with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So if we think about it in English, verse 1 would begin with A, verse 2 would begin with B, verse 3 would begin with C, etc. And so Psalm 145 is a psalm like that, where verse 1 begins with Aleph, verse 2 begins with verse 3 begins with Gimel, etc. However, although all the alphabet theoretically should be present in an acrostic psalm, and this one especially because it starts with Aleph and it ends with Tav, that the problem becomes that there is no verse that begins with the Hebrew letter Nun, which is about right in the middle of the alphabet. And so it'd be like skipping the N, right? There is no verse that begins with N, but you have A to Z with no N. And so the rabbis who believed in the divine inspiration of Scripture looked at this as, okay, on the one hand, we believe in the inspiration of Scripture. God knows his alphabet. So why is the N skipped over? I mean, if you're looking at it from a secular perspective, you could just simply say, right, a mistake was made. Right? The author, as they were going through, just happened to forget the N. But for the rabbis who believed in the inspiration of Scripture, there has to be some sort of answer. Now, in many respects, this requires a lot of biblical literacy to really understand this argument. So it's not necessarily something that the common person would pick up on. Perhaps even if they were reading it in Hebrew. So the rabbis here find a gap or an omission, and so they kind of have the opportunity here to do some rabbinical teaching. And so various rabbis have attempted to explain this. And so the one rabbi said, Rabbi Yohanan, says that, well, it's not there because the word for downfall or fallen begins with Nun. And so in order to not think about or talk about Israel's downfall, the verse was skipped. Now, we might immediately say, okay, well, there are a lot of other words that begin with Nun, right? Even if we don't know Hebrew, it would make sense. Like a lot of other words would be. But, this is what the rabbis are approaching. Another rabbi, Naaman bar Isaac, he says, no, it's not so much. Yes, there's this element of not wanting to talk about the fall of Israel. But it really is in there. Because in the next verse, the word Nophilim, which is connected with the word fallen, right? Naphalah, Nophilim, they're the same word, they're just different forms. And so the Nun is there, it's just not at the beginning of a verse. Right? So it's in there, but it's not where you would normally think of. And so it's kind of like Naaman bar Isaac says, okay, I accept what Rabbi Yohanan says, but David is still moved to include the Nun because in order that you have a complete acrostic. So it's a really kind of interesting approach. I'm not necessarily saying it's valid, and I don't know necessarily that if we, if push came to shove, a lot of Jews would find it valid. But the validity of it from one perspective isn't the point. The point is more, what's the opportunity to teach and to think through and talk about some things related to the text and some exploration that, in a sense, God is, in this mindset, God is giving people the opportunity to really address the text and interact with the text rather than just the text being something flat that you must obey and there isn't room for questioning and for trying to figure out what to do about some challenges. So again, the validity of it isn't the point. The question of paradox isn't the point. The question of, is this truly what the text mean, isn't the point. The point is about the opportunity for teaching, for exploration, especially shaped by the imagination. Well, we turn from thinking about rabbinical Judaism to more modern Judaism and some of the things we see in contemporary Jewish society. And particularly, we'll be looking at different expressions of Judaism in contemporary life. This is not to suggest that this is not to suggest we should ignore Judaism in the Middle Ages, the early modern period. Right? We're kind of jumping historically here, but it does reflect we have a limited amount of time to talk about this religion and other religions, so we're just kind of getting snapshots at different times. And so I certainly would encourage you, if you have the chance, to looking through some of those aspects of Jewish history. And really, there are some things that, especially those of us that are Christians, really need to come to terms with, and understanding the ways in which Christians persecuted Jews throughout the Middle Ages, and the terrible ways in which we as Christians blamed Jews for a lot of problems, sometimes even killing Jews for that. And while the Holocaust, that we'll talk about in another lecture, certainly is terrible in its size, it's unfortunate that that similar types of things, yes, on a smaller scale, but similar types of things were happening at other times as well. And that's a part of a history that we need to realize. There are a variety of types of Judaism today. Basically, there are three major types: Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. Reform is probably the largest worldwide, with Conservative being a close second, and then Orthodox being smaller than those two. There are some other varieties, and there are varieties within some of these other traditions, and then there are also some smaller types of Judaism that we'll talk about in a subsequent lecture. So we're just looking at the major ones, and just looking at brief overviews. I would refer you to the textbook for more in-depth discussion of some of these things. We'll start with Orthodox Judaism. Not to suggest that Orthodox Judaism is the true Judaism, nor is this to suggest that Orthodox Judaism is actually the oldest type of Judaism. Prior to the 18th century, there wasn't an Orthodox Judaism in one sense, because Orthodox Judaism didn't really, Jews didn't think of themselves in that way. It's only as we get into the modern period when some Jews started to try and modernize Judaism that there was an extensive movement to try and say, no, this is traditional Judaism, this is Orthodox Judaism. So while some of the practices expressed in Orthodox Judaism have a long history, longer than the 18th century, 17th century, Orthodox Judaism, as a specifically named movement, as a codified expression of Judaism, is a modern phenomenon in response to the development of Reform Judaism. So let's talk about some of the characteristics of Orthodox Judaism. Again, we're doing highlights. This is not comprehensive in any way, but just to kind of give us some ideas of the different types of Judaism and how they relate to each other. Within Orthodox Judaism, one of the concerns is for the preservation of Jewish tradition. Other forms of Judaism are not as concerned about maintaining Jewish tradition as it's been expressed throughout history. The idea behind this is that Orthodox Judaism, or the traditional practices of Judaism, are closer to what God originally intended, and because of that, those things need to be preserved. That any sort of change moves Judaism away from what God intended. So, for example, Orthodox Jews hold their services in Hebrew, right, maintaining that connection with the past. Really, there's almost a quasi-divine status because it's the language of the Hebrew Bible, right? And so it's kind of almost a holy language. For some Jews, the only Hebrew they know is for the prayers and the sermons in the synagogue. Others, of course, that live in Israel would know modern Hebrew, and other Orthodox Jews might know enough Hebrew to read certain passages in the Torah. But despite that, there is still this emphasis on worship being done in Hebrew. Also important, not just Hebrew itself, but the keeping of the Torah and the traditions and the laws are very important, right? Observing the rituals, observing the holidays and festivals, keeping the food laws. All of these are important aspects of Orthodox Judaism as it's practiced today. And that's reflected in some of the practices that Orthodox Jews engage in. Now, Reformed Jews, conservative Jews engage in prayer, right? But in Orthodox Judaism, there is an emphasis on the wearing of specific objects in praying. For example, the wearing of the tallit, that's the prayer shawl. You can see in the picture on the right, this gentleman, as he's reading probably something from the Hebrew Bible, has that shawl around his shoulders, kind of hanging down off of him. You can kind of see some fringes at the end of it. That would be a prayer shawl, sometimes pulled over the head in praying, as we saw in the previous slide. Sometimes Orthodox Jews and other types of more traditional Jews might wear that underneath their garments, so that they're so it's a smaller, and so they might wear it under a shirt or a jacket or something like that. So it's kind of, you're always wearing it, so to speak. Another important part of prayer, and sometimes worn in other places, is the tefillin. You can also see that in the picture on the right, the black box on the gentleman's forehead, and then there's that leather strap that goes down, and if you see it on his left arm, it's kind of wrapped around his arm down to his hand. Most often, within the box is a passage of scripture that essentially the idea here is that there's a passage in Deuteronomy that you are to bind the law between your eyes, right, on your forehead. So that's kind of what this is meant to do. The boxes are not used on the Sabbath in many cases, because to tie it like you would need to do would involve work. Orthodox Jews also are frequently distinguished from other types of Judaism based on distinctive dress. Also, including the kippah or the yarmulke, you can see in the two pictures here, two of these gentlemen having this cap, usually worn toward the back of the head. Kippah is Hebrew. Yarmulke is Yiddish, which is kind of a mixture of Hebrew and German. Often they are worn while praying or at a synagogue service. More and more you're starting to see some Orthodox Jews wearing them in other types of situations. Orthodox Jews are also very consistent about, or try to be consistent and strict about what can and cannot be done on the Sabbath. We've mentioned before about driving cars on the Sabbath. That was this kind of any place you need to go, you would need to walk. There are other practices of similar types of things about what you can and can't do on the Sabbath. And while more modernized Jews might be open to not holding to some of those traditions, a lot of Orthodox Jews try to follow them. Orthodox Jews also try to follow the dietary laws, the laws of kashrut, or keeping kosher. Some of this is based off of the laws found in the book of Leviticus. There are also some other laws related to the traditions of the elders, the kind of oral tradition that developed to explain these laws. The laws are called kashrut. Often you'll hear people talking about keeping kosher. Kashrut, as a system of food laws, covers three elements. It covers what can and cannot be eaten. Right? So one aspect is you can eat these things, you can't eat those things. A second element is how something is prepared. So it's not just what can, something could be perhaps legal or lawful to eat, but it's got to be prepared in a certain way. So some of this would be, for example, the restriction against eating blood. Right? So you might be able to eat an animal, but if you don't drain all the blood out of that animal, then it's still not acceptable to eat. And so what can and cannot be eaten, how something is prepared, and the third element is what can be eaten together. And so there are certain things that can be eaten together, certain things that cannot be eaten together. So dairy and meat are usually, there are traditions that are meant to keep those two apart. And so some Orthodox Jews will actually have two separate kitchens, one where they keep the dairy products, one they can keep the meat products in. The reason behind this, or kind of the scriptural basis that eventually developed into this practice, is the restriction in the law about eating a young goat boiled in its mother's milk. Probably a restriction mentioned a couple times in the books of Moses. Now, probably what is in mind there is some Canaanite religious practices, and so it's more an effort to try and say, don't be involved in these Canaanite practices, these idolatrous practices, but again, as a means to try and prevent people from accidentally breaking that. If you don't eat meat and dairy together, you're never going to boil a young goat in its mother's milk. And so it's another way to kind of keep a fence around the Torah, prevent people from breaking it. So that's an important aspect of this, is the tradition trying to establish, some of the things of how people can make sure that they don't break what the law was put in place to do. Food and grocery stores will often bear the letter Kaf, which is pictured there on the right, or the letter K. That one there, the Hebrew letter there around the K. Sometimes a U in a circle. It might say parve or pareve on it. All of these are to indicate that something is kosher. That if it's followed the laws of kashrut. Even when it comes to Fast food, right? Here's a kosher McDonald's. As you can kind of see, you might be able to see on the right-hand side, it says kosher, and then in Hebrew on the left-hand side. Of course, you wouldn't be able to order a cheeseburger there because that would not be, first of all, that wouldn't be kosher. But then probably they probably wouldn't have the meat and the dairy available. In many respects, it wouldn't be surprising to think about how Orthodox Judaism would be in decline in the modern time. That as more and more we move through modernization, that fewer and fewer people would be interested in Orthodox Judaism. In some ways, that makes sense. In some ways, historically, that makes sense. But there were some things that took place in the middle of the 20th century that did kind of lead to a little bit of an Orthodox resurgence, or at least renewed interest in some things related to Orthodox Judaism. Largely, the Holocaust had a very important part in that. That as people, as Jews especially, came to understand how many Jews were killed in the Holocaust. There was this desire to, participate in some of the traditional forms of Judaism, and some of the traditional practices and holidays of Judaism. And really also, so there was the Holocaust, which probably had the largest impact on this, but there was also, in the United States especially, a general religious revival that took place across Christian denominations and Judaism in the post-World War II period. And so that brought a lot of people, a lot of Jews, to be more interested in their background, some of the practices. And so even Reform Jews, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, reincorporated some elements of traditional practice, like using Hebrew at certain parts. Didn't completely abandon using vernacular, but there were some practices that were reincorporated. Additionally, there were some people, some younger Jews, that had been born into other types of Judaism that in the post-World War II period decided to convert to Judaism. These people were known as Ba'alei Teshuvah, or returning Jews, or penitent Jews, might be a good way to kind of translate this. In many respects, for Orthodox Judaism, even though you might be a Reform Jew, you had to convert. It wasn't just a simple matter of changing membership, like what we may think of when Christian denominations. This was more of a conversion, and so it reflects a little bit of the ways in which Orthodox Jews look at other types of Judaism. So you have more people practicing traditional forms of Judaism. You have this interest among younger Jews in Orthodox Judaism. However, I don't want to kind of suggest that there was this sudden influx, because a lot of the Jews born into Orthodox Jewish families, as they grew up, were leaving Judaism for either atheism or secularism or other types of Judaism. So the number of people coming into Orthodox Judaism was not as much as the number leaving. So there was some resurgence, but not this large influx of people into Orthodox Judaism. Additionally, though, Orthodox Jews became much more open about expressing their commitment to Orthodoxy in very obvious ways. So the yarmulke, for example, traditionally it had been worn during synagogue services and other types of situations, but that was predominantly it. Well, in the later 20th century, more and more Orthodox Jews became open to wearing the yarmulke out in public, to wearing it at work, other types of things that weren't necessarily connected to prayer or synagogue services, um, as a visual marker of their commitment, their practice of an Orthodox form of Judaism. And so this late 20th century, more and more Orthodox Jews were more open to expressing their identity as Jews. And some of that has to do with some of the things we talked about already that we've highlighted, the Holocaust, the religious revival, but then also the public is more open in the later 20th century towards Jews. There's still a lot of challenge, there's still a lot of anti-Semitism. But in the early 20th century, there was a real significant anti-Semitic view throughout the United States. And we'll talk some about that when we talk about the Holocaust. And so there was more of a cultural pressure for Jews to assimilate and not be obviously Jewish, like you would wearing a kippah or yarmulke, something like that. But in the later 20th century, with the Holocaust and some other things, there was more of a, that doesn't matter to me because I'm going to publicly identify as a Jew. We turn from Orthodoxy to talk about a smaller group, not a very large group, smaller group known as Hasidic Judaism or Hasidism. Often, Hasidic Judaism is thought of as a type of Orthodoxy, and Hasidic Judaism and Orthodox Judaism are sometimes used interchangeably or thought of interchangeably. But there are some distinct differences between mainstream Orthodox Judaism and Hasidic Jews. And so some of that is, I mean, there's some similar interests, but there are some other differences as well. One major difference is that Hasidic Judaism is shaped by the teachings and ideas of a man named Israel ben Eleazar, who lived in the late 1600s into the early 1700s. And it's these teachings that shaped Hasidic Judaism. It's not shaped Orthodoxy. Israel ben Eleazar was also known as the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name being the name of God, right? So instead of using God's name, you might say the name. So he's the master of the good name. Sometimes abbreviated the Besht from the Baal Shem Tov, so the Besht. He lived predominantly in Eastern Europe for most of his life, places like Romania and the Ukraine. Most of the people that he encountered as he went on his travels were largely uneducated, especially when it came to Hebrew, and so they weren't really interested in the more intellectual forms of Judaism. And so the Besht offered them a simple message. Right? And so the focus was on simplicity rather than the complexity of traditional rabbinic, more Orthodox Judaism. Specifically, he told them that the best way of encountering God was through practicing humility, engaging in good deeds, praying, and living a life of joy. There are some reports that developed of his ability to heal, some other things about him, which probably also precipitated the, referring to him as the master of the good name, right? And that he's somehow closer to God. As people started to accept his message, adopt his message, they became known as Hasidim, or pious ones. The Besht and leaders after him were known as Zadik, a righteous person, sometimes referred to as Rebbes, or the leaders. This was predominantly a hereditary office that was passed on to children. So the Zadik or the Rebbe would pass it on to their children. A couple things related to the practices. Hasidic Jews have distinctive modes of dress. The men wear beards, as well as the side locks, which are those strands of curly hair that come down near the ears, kind of near the sideburns. They often wear hats, frequently fur-trimmed hats, and long coats. This is one of the markers that makes them distinct from Orthodox Jews. Orthodox Jews often wear some simplistic type of clothing as well, often wear they could just kind of like black and white clothing, but the long coats, and the hats, is really a marker of Hasidic Judaism more so than Orthodox Judaism. There are some other things related to gender. Women, both married and not, wear wigs. Hair is considered to be a temptation, and so married women will shave off their hair and wear wigs. Some Orthodox women do this as well, and so the idea is that the hair, to see someone else's hair is tempting, sexually tempting, and so the wig is meant to kind of counteract some of that, or cutting the hair short. Hasidic Jews tend to be a little bit more egalitarian in some ways than Orthodoxy. They are not like Reform Jews, which are much more egalitarian. Reform Jews have women rabbis, but there's the opportunity for it's the opportunity for education, other things where women can have some more prominent roles, but actual equality may be more illusory. So there's some questions there, but there are some very distinct expressions of gender. Some Hasidic women, and even some Orthodox women, kind of welcome some of these things like wearing wigs and simplified modes of dress because they claim it prevents them from being objectified like a lot of non-Jewish women would be, or even Reform Jewish women, by wearing provocative clothing or other things. Women have been objectified, and so conservative, well, not conservative, but Hasidic and Orthodox women might feel that this kind of protects them to some extent. Again, how far to actually consider that, but that's the way some women feel about that. Hasidic Jews traditionally have been rather isolationist. They tend to live in groups. A lot of them live in New York and the surrounding areas of New York City predominantly. They prefer to live separate from others. In more recent years, there have been attempts to try and at least appear open to outsiders by allowing outsiders to maybe tour cities or areas of cities where they live. Crown Heights, for example, in New York City, is a very prominent Hasidic Jewish community, and so offering tours allows people to kind of see how Hasidic Jews live, different things like that. So in more recent times, there has been some openness, but there's still this idea of wanting to live separate from other people. Some Hasidic communities, of course, there are different types of Hasidic Judaism. Some communities tend to be very intensely messianic. They believe that the Messiah is coming, hasn't come, right? So the idea that Jesus is the Messiah, of course, is denied by all Jews. But some Jews are more open to thinking about a Messiah, a personal Messiah, still coming. Hasidic Judaism is one of those. And One specific type is Lubavitch Hasidism. They come from the Belarusian city of Lubavitch, sometimes referred to as Lubavitchers instead of just Lubavitch Hasidism. After World War I, a lot of the practitioners of this form of Hasidism living in the Soviet Union, really faced a lot of persecution, and eventually the Rebbe moved to the United States in 1940, getting away from both the Soviets as well as the Nazis. In 1950, the seventh Lubavitcher rabbi was selected, a man named Menachem Schneerson. His father-in-law, who was also a distant cousin, was the sixth Rebbe. He died, and Schneerson became the new Rebbe. He was more open. He's the older gentleman pictured in the lower right-hand corner. He welcomed modernity, welcomed some modernization to the community, more than others had as well. He had studied mathematics, for example, in a secular university. His wife had also studied in a university, a secular university. He also modified some of the dress styles, wearing of a shorter coat, for example, instead of the longer coats like seen in the upper picture on the right. The community, after World War II had ended, had really become very focused on messianic expectations, and also began to grow some, and some began to suspect that Schneerson was the Messiah. He was childless, the movement was growing, so maybe he was the Messiah. And some believe that he was actually hinting at this in some of his messages. Schneerson died in 1994, and many of the people in the community believed that he was going to be resurrected. And there were even some claims that he was miraculously responding to letters, to people's petitions, kind of almost prayer-like things. So, there was some expectation that he actually was the Messiah, even after his death. Again, just one type of Hasidic Judaism, not all types. There were other types that did not accept this notion of Schneerson's messiahhood. We turn now to thinking about Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism developed in the 18th century in Europe. Now, in thinking about 18th century Europe, a very important philosophical development was the Enlightenment. Now, there had been predecessors of the Enlightenment in the 17th century, but the 18th century really is when the Enlightenment started flowering. And the Enlightenment fostered ideas that the current age was more advanced than the past, and that human beings best understand the world around them through reason. It was about, there was an emphasis on progression and being more progressive than the past. And there was also an emphasis on the importance of using reason even when you examine religious beliefs. And so there was a lot of ways in which religion was modernizing in the 18th century. And this had an impact on Judaism as well. It would have an impact on Christianity also in Europe. But you would have an impact on this on 18th century Judaism also. And so this influence led to an attitude of progress, and some Jews especially began to question the traditions of Judaism. Many Jews in early modern Europe were segregated. They were forced to live in ghettos in their own communities, separate from other Europeans. And so there was this desire among some Jews to be more integrated in the culture, be more involved in public life, but they felt and believed that there were certain aspects of Judaism that kept them from being involved in modern life. One of those, who's often referred to as the father of Reform Judaism, is Moses Mendelssohn. Now, Mendelssohn didn't completely push for reform. Mendelssohn pictured here in a painting in the lower right. He didn't completely imbibe the spirit of reform, but he did set the stage for its transformation. He was a philosopher, and he began to advocate some changes that he thought would allow Jews to participate more in German society, lived in Germany. There were some aspects of Judaism Mendelssohn didn't believe should be changed. But he believed that there were some places where adaptation, modernization could take place. Additionally, Mendelssohn advocated that Jews should hold and could identify themselves according to certain national identities that would allow them to participate in their nation's life as citizens. So instead of looking for a Jewish homeland, instead of looking for a nation state of Israel for Jews to stay in, just be and seek the best for the country you're living in. Now, in the 18th century, of course, there is not a state of Israel. Jews are scattered in various places. And so Mendelssohn, like other Reformed Jews, while they might have liked to and would have liked a state of Israel, Mendelssohn saying, we live in these different countries, let's participate more fully in our countries, and so we have to kind of adopt certain things related to those countries we live in. Reform Judaism was also shaped by the European Christianity of the time. In many respects, we can kind of think of it as a response to the European Christianity and trying to become more like European Christianity so there wouldn't be as much distinction, and maybe even holding on to Jewish children, young adults, etc. And so Reform Judaism introduced musical instruments. Prior to this time, musical instruments were not used in Jewish worship. Orthodox Jews today still do not use musical instruments. In many cases, it's kind of looked at as the musical instruments were connected with the temple worship. Musical instruments were never really used in the synagogues. And so when the temple was destroyed, there wasn't a need for musical instruments. But by this time, right, 1700s in Europe, there were musical instruments in European Christianity, and so Reform Judaism introduced musical instruments to their worship. They also began vernacular prayer and sermons. So instead of preaching in and praying in Hebrew, it would be in German or English. And the sermons were often shorter, more along the lines of a Protestant sermon, instead of the longer sermons of traditional Judaism. For a time, Reformed Jews also moved to Sunday worship to be more in line with European Christianity. Eventually, though, that change was abandoned and worship was renewed on Saturday, on the Sabbath. Reformers would make other changes as well, changes in dress, being more modern in dress, more cultural in dress. Additionally, many reformers would start referring to the synagogue as a temple instead of a synagogue. Many of them had, by this point, 18th century into the 19th century, given up the idea that there would be a rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. And so the temple could be an expression of wherever Jews gathered. And so the synagogue became the temple. Another example of how this is changing and some of the impact it would have on the relationship between more traditional forms of Judaism and more modern forms of Judaism can be seen in what took place in the later 19th century in the United States, in an event sometimes referred to as the Treifa banquet. In the late 1800s, some Reformed Jews opened a rabbinical seminary in the city of Cincinnati known as Hebrew Union College. Now, it was not the only rabbinical seminary in the United States, but for a time it was a center for moderate Reformed Judaism. And so, it was kind of an important aspect of the development of Reformed Judaism. A lot of rabbis to this point had been educated in Europe, and so you're beginning to see more and more rabbinical education in the United States. In 1883, the first class of rabbis, 4 rabbis, was ordained. And like I said, prior to this point, many of the rabbis were educated in Europe and then came to America. And so this was a pretty important development, and because of that, there was an attempt to offer a ceremony of goodwill. And so at the ordination ceremony itself, there were Jews from all different types of Judaism, Reform Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, attending the ordination ceremony. All right, so you have them from all over the country, and then from both Orthodox and Reform Judaism. And it was a very evidently well-received expression, a well-received ceremony, a lot of goodwill, and really maybe some feelings of maybe the two groups can work together, or maybe the animosity that has been developed, maybe that can be overdone. However, there was a banquet that was held 3 hours after the ceremony. It had been organized by Reform leaders, some of which were not, by this point keeping kosher. The caterers were Jewish, but they were Reform Jews who had largely given up following the laws of kashrut. And so on the menu were clams, crab, shrimp, and frog legs, all of which are treif, or unclean or unkosher, hence the treifa banquet, right, the serving of these unclean foods. Additionally, meat and dairy were also served together. So the Jewish caterers who had abandoned kashrut, they just kind of took it as don't serve pork, which of course there's a lot more to keeping kosher, as we just pointed out, than not serving pork. Well, the traditionalists, the Orthodox Jews, were highly offended, and many of them left the banquet. And the goodwill that had been so much a part of the ordination ceremony really began to fall apart. And so this really solidified the break, especially in the United States, between Reform Jews and Orthodox Jews over some issues related to food. Also in the later 19th century, a couple of years after that, the Reform Jews attempted to try and define who they were. Right? Who are we really? And not so much in opposition to Orthodox Judaism, but just kind of more of a positive expression of who Reform or what Reform Judaism was. It was created in 1885. Some individuals refer to it as Reform Judaism's Declaration of Independence. We'll talk more and go more extensively in another section. We'll go through the Pittsburgh Platform more specifically, because this is a document that you can write one of the reflective essays. The first reflective essay is focused on the Pittsburgh Platform, and so we'll spend some time in another video kind of going through and talking about this in more detail. But just to kind of give you a brief overview as we're talking about Reform Judaism, because I do think it points to the ways in which Reform Judaism is developing as it becomes distinct from Orthodox Judaism. One of the first positions in the Pittsburgh Platform is the idea that Judaism, the statement that Judaism was the highest conception of the God idea. Well, what's being suggested here is that there essentially is a historical development of truth, especially when it came to God. Right? Judaism is the highest conception, but that means other people have some truth as well. So, first of all, you have this openness to others having truth, and not just Jews, but also by referring to it as the God idea, there was an openness here that was kind of rejected later on, but an openness here in the late 19th century of God being beyond just a personal being. Maybe God is not a personal being, but something else, right? But there's the God idea. So this in itself, of course, is different than Orthodox or traditional Judaism by opening up the possibility of other people having truth, as well as kind of open up the possibility of looking beyond God being a personal being. Another position within the Pittsburgh Platform was the claim that modern science research was not antagonistic to Judaism, specifically thinking here of evolution and evolution's challenge to traditional biblical versions of the origins of humanity, the creation of the world. Judaism and Reform Judaism could change and adapt, and science could help it understand the world better. So there wasn't a need to be concerned about scientific developments that questioned traditional approaches. A third position was the view that ceremony should elevate and sanctify lives. Right? Specifically in mind are traditional ideas about food and dress and other practices. These separate Jews from the larger culture. They're foreign to the modern age, and so there shouldn't be a need to hold on to certain practices if they can be abandoned in the modern age. Instead, does a ritual provide something to a person's life? So there has to be more than just the rote following of a ceremony or a ritual practice. It's got to have some sort of impact on a person's life. A fourth position was the approach of the millennial age, suggesting a lot of optimism, beliefs that that a great period of peace and prosperity was coming, that the Jews were the hope for the world, right? The Jews were going to help usher in this period of great peace and prosperity. But also the idea here is that it was less of a personal Messiah. Right? Reform Jews are kind of rejecting the idea that there was an individual known as the Messiah who was going to be coming. That instead, what should be the expectation should be for this great period, instead of a personal Messiah. Another position in the Pittsburgh Platform was a focus on Judaism being a religious community and not a political or national group. And so at the late 19th century, a lot of Reform Jews expected that there was not going to be a return to the Middle East. There was not going to be a renewed state of Israel. There was not going to be a temple. There was not going to be a new priestly sacrificial system. All of that was gone. And so Judaism was about being religious, and their nationality was what was part of whatever country they were a part of. Now, in some ways, we might look back and say, well, this is a little short-sighted because in just 60-something years, there would be a state of Israel. Well, right, at the time, that seemed unlikely, if not impossible. And so, we don't want to kind of, be overly critical about this because, who knows what's going to happen in 60 years from now? Now, when the nation of Israel was created, this was walked back, and so there was a lot of emphasis on supporting Israel. But, the idea being at the time, a lot of other Jews were hoping, looking for restarting of Israel, and Reform Judaism said, that's not happening. Let's just work for the good of the countries we're in. A sixth plank in the platform was the idea that Judaism was a progressive religion. Judaism could change and should change with the times and with the understanding of reason and modern thought and science. Contrary to Orthodox Judaism, which wanted to hold on to the ceremonies and traditions of older ages. Also important were the daughter religions, Christianity and Islam, right, recognizing that these were connected religions, that these were expressions of ideas coming from Judaism, an openness to working with Christian and Muslims in certain causes. Again, quite different than Orthodox Judaism, largely because Orthodox Judaism had the long memory of the persecution that Jews faced from Christians and Muslims, but Reform Jews living in the United States were more open to those kind of connections. So essentially what the Reformers did here was to maintain the monotheistic core and the ethical core, and then reinterpret other aspects of Judaism. The third major type of Judaism is conservative Judaism. And conservative Judaism is somewhere in between Orthodox and Reform Jews. Sometimes it looks more like Orthodox Judaism on some particular topics or practices. At other times it looks like Reform Judaism. Conservative Judaism had some European components to it, but it is the Judaism that develops predominantly out of things taking place in the United States, unlike Orthodox and Reform. The conservative movement developed from a split from Orthodoxy rather than from Reform Judaism. So some of the major issues that led to a split between Orthodox and Reform were still in Orthodox Judaism. And eventually more Orthodox Jews left to develop conservative Judaism. So in other words, these were Orthodox Jews who became more liberal, and they were not Reform Jews who became conservative. Right? So it comes from Orthodoxy. And so this was another split that happened because of modern issues and other things that had taken place related to Judaism. As the name would suggest, conservative Jews were more interested in conserving as much as possible instead of necessarily reforming Judaism. The idea was there are things that need to change, but let's keep as much as possible. Usually, the criteria for whether something was kept or not had to do with historical precedents. Reform Judaism, modifications took place supposedly based on rational decisions of modern life. For conservative Jews, it had to do with how old of a practice is this? Right? So if it has a historical legacy, a very long historical legacy, then it should be kept. For example, the order of worship in a service was believed to be from the times of the Second Temple. Right? So, 2,000 plus years ago. Because it's from that point, conservative Jews have kept it, which makes them look more like Orthodox Jews. However, forms of dress, like the long coats or other types of things found among Hasidic Jews or Orthodox Jews, some of those come from the 15th century or later. So they're only 300 or 400 years old. And so they abandoned those things. They aren't from a long period of time. And so, that was kind of the way in which conservative Jews operated in thinking about who they were. I mean, it's a matter of what should be conserved. Now, in many respects, as I mentioned, in some ways, conservative Judaism looks like Orthodoxy. In other ways, it looks like Reform. They do look at Judaism in some ways, like Reform, for example, as Judaism being a developing religion, right? By the very fact of you can take some things and leave some things, right? It's developed. Now, Reform Judaism did that, but conservative Judaism, the focus was on tradition. So instead of rejecting something, rejecting the past full scale, as they thought the Reform Jews did, then it's more about this, the length of time. It's more of a self-conscious approach. There's elements here of, thinking through, what's the history of this practice, right? In many respects, the conservatives also tried to have a more harmonious approach to the practices than Reform Jews. Conservatives tried to allow for diversity of opinions, right? And so the different rabbis have the freedom to talk about things in different ways, but there's still some boundaries there. And so the conservatives accepted some of the adaptations of Reform Judaism, using English in the services, having family seating. Right? Orthodox Judaism, men and women sit in different places. They're separated. Reform Judaism, families were allowed to sit together, etc. Well, conservatives picked that up. Again, a lot of the ideas for conservative Jews was, right, the Reform Jews just kind of get rid of anything old. We're trying to deliberately and historically examine those things. The idea is that we are conserving traditional practices or deliberately making changes. We're not just getting rid of everything old. That there are some things that need to be conserved, and there's some traditions that need to be held, but there's some things that can be different. The law can be adapted to modern life, but it cannot be discarded wholesale, right? You can't just get rid of the entire law. The community, however, needs to agree on how these take place. But there's no specific, national synagogue or anything like that makes those decisions. So you do have diversity among different synagogues in that. There are a couple other forms of Judaism that we will pick up on and talk about in a later lecture. So we will stop there for this session, and pick up later talking about some of these other types of Judaism that are smaller but still representative of some of these different trends.